I started to meditate because I was anxious, like an undergrad, you know, I was uptight. And I found it relaxed me. I did it twice a day, morning, prepared me for the day. Afternoon, I took a nap every time. I couldn't get
Who was it? What kind of meditation was it?
I started with TM.
Yeah.
It's a great beginning practice. When I got to Harvard, I was lucky enough to get a pre-doctoral traveling fellowship to India. And I was really interested since I was studying clinical psychology. I went to Asia, I went to India, and I met people who were off that map.
Yeah.
One of them was famous yogi Neem Karoli Baba, who was Ram Dass's guru. He was extraordinary. He was loving, he was super present. And when you were with him, you felt like you loved everybody too. That was magic. And I met Kunu Lama, who was this very humble Tibetan monk in Bodh Gaya.
This Kunu Lama is a very, very famous Lama. And he's famous for being the most humble of the humble.
People like that. And I came back to Harvard, I said, hey, guess what? There's great news. There's an upside to human potential. It's not all what's wrong with you.
And they told me that after I spent 3 months in India and Sri Lanka with Dan after my second year of graduate school, but when it first began, my very first day of graduate school, I took my first course, and I knew about Dan before I got to Harvard because he published a few articles in this really obscure journal called the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. Not one of our top-ranked journals. It doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
But these were articles on meditation that I had read as an undergraduate, and so I knew Dan was there.
This Swami X claimed, I can control my autonomic nervous system with no feedback. So we got him in the lab and we asked him to raise his heart rate, and he lowered it. And we asked him to lower his heart rate, and he raised it. And then he did a special thing for us, which he called dog samadhi, which is otherwise known as atrial fibrillation. It's not a great talent to have. You can die from that. So that was our first understanding, because that you can hype research on meditation. Afterward, wherever he spoke, he said, and scientists at Harvard have studied my brain. Which would say what we found. Yeah. So one of our motives for writing this book, Altered Traits, is there a book here?
There is a book.
Yeah.
So, Altered Traits,
right.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you. Was to put together the best research. There's now 6,000 peer-reviewed articles. There's more than 1,000 a year now. When we did our dissertations, there were 2. Do you remember that?
I do.
Both really bad. And our dissertations, by the way, would not meet the standards to get in this book today. Would you agree?
Totally.
Yeah. So standards have ratcheted upward, and we wanted to put together in one place the evidence that, you know, meditation actually is of value. It's not all hype. There's good research, and in fact, it shows real benefits.
Robert Thurman, professor at Columbia, he often translates the word yogi as yogi scientists. And from the Eastern point of view, these great yogis in a tradition of thousands of years of refining their understanding and experience of consciousness, of what mind is, nature of mind. What is nature of mind? And how does that interact with our sense of ourselves as a separate being? Is in fact this a separate being or not? But they didn't have the machines to measure these things. It was a completely subjective experience for them. Now the guides in the lineage were people who were great experts at this. Would be the great geniuses of this type of meditation, that type of meditation, who would be able to walk them through the experience and make sure that it was a valid experience based on the tradition and also what they wanted in the process of the meditative sequencing. We don't have that here. Our science doesn't do that. It has to be measurable by machines.
Please take them outside the religious context, bring them into the lab, study them as rigorously as you can, and if they're of value, spread them as widely as you can. So that's really what this book is about.
Well, and the other is epigenetics. Neuroplasticity is the idea that the brain changes in response to experience.
This is very recent, is it
very
not?
Recent.
Like completely recent, like within a decade and a half.
Last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
Exactly. And neuroplasticity happens all the time, wittingly or unwittingly. And most of the time, neuroplasticity is happening unwittingly. Most of the time, our brains are being shaped by forces around us about which we have little awareness.
So if you...
Because we are just continuously being shaped in this way. And epigenetics is the science of how genes are regulated. And we're all born with a fixed complement of base pairs that constitute our DNA. And for the most part, that's not going to change. But what will change is the extent to which different genes are turned on and turned off. And so you can think of genes having little volume controls that go from low to high. And that varies a lot. And it turns out that those variations are really meaningful for health. And one of the things we found is just a couple of years ago, we published a paper showing that if we bring meditators to the laboratory, and these are folks like us who are not professional meditators, who have day jobs, and have them practice for a full day, and we just take a blood sample in the morning and then in the late afternoon, after a period of, say, 6 or 7 hours of practice, we actually can see changes in gene expression and in these what we call epigenetic marks that are observable. And we were specifically looking at changes in gene expression for genes that are involved in inflammation, which is an important domain in many chronic illnesses. And so these kinds of data suggest that we can produce enduring change in ways that were unthinkable. So neuroplasticity is not necessarily good or bad. Neuroplasticity is happening all the time. And there are certain things that we can do to stimulate increased neuroplasticity. But if we increase neuroplasticity...
Well, define that a little more. Just give people a good definition of that.
So the extent to which the brain changes varies across people. It's not all the same. And it also changes over the course of development. We know, for example, that very young kids can learn a second language much more easily at a certain age. They can learn a musical instrument.
So that's a form of plasticity.
That's a form of plasticity. And that's a sensitive period in development. It actually may be that kindness and compassion have a similar sensitive period. And if we nurture kids during that period, it can be enormously...
Is there any indication that there is a prime period for learning this?
There's some indication. We have developed in our center a curriculum that we call the kindness curriculum, which is designated for preschool kids 4 and 5 years of age, which by...
And almost all of His Holiness's work saying that we, by nature, are loving and kind and empathic. We are taught not to be in our lives. Our environment teaches us that way. But I think it's one of the reasons that this neuroplasticity in terms of positive emotions and really helpful emotions and joyous emotions, it's not that hard to access.
Well,
it
actually,
will be there.
We found very good news. When we looked at the best studies on kindness, loving kindness, which is a meditation that's become more and more popular, we found that the brain or the mind seems to be prepared to learn to love better. For beginners, even, the outcomes of being more generous, paying more attention to people around you, things like that, happen very quickly, more quickly than with other aspects that we measured. So it seems that we're primed for love, which is a wonderful finding.
Do you want to go into more detail about the kinds of meditation, the practices themselves that you were looking at, what the aim of those practices are, and maybe a little bit about how they work, what the yogic process is that you were evaluating?
Well, in terms of the scientific research, there are 2 kinds of meditation practice that have been studied the most extensively. One is basic mindfulness kinds of practices. And when we talk about mindfulness practices, we are speaking about practices that invite a person to bring awareness to their bodies, to their thoughts, to their emotions, to external sensations, and to know that they're aware. There's a certain quality of knowing that seems to be intrinsic to our capacity to be aware, and recognizing that knowing is really what these mindfulness practices are about. And it turns out that these simple mindfulness practices, even practiced for just a short amount of time, seem to improve aspects of our attention. They also improve what scientists have called meta-awareness, which is the ability to recognize that you are aware. And one of the ways that you can think about this, we've all had the experience of being in a movie theater and being really engrossed in a movie. And to the extent that we're not even aware that we're sitting in a theater. We're so wrapped up in the plot. But we also could be sitting in a movie theater, totally attentive to the movie, but in the background recognizing that we're sitting in a theater. And it's that background recognition that seems to be something that we call meta-awareness that's cultivated with these simple mindfulness practices that turns out to provide a kind of leverage to allow a person to better regulate their emotions, to not get ensnared, not get hijacked.
Not to identify so much.
Not to identify, yeah. And that's something really key. And then the second class of practices that have been studied extensively are these practices that are designed to cultivate qualities of kindness, of love, compassion. Again, one of the amazing things is that you see changes there's data showing changes after just 8 minutes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that those changes are going to last. But what it does show, as Danny was suggesting, is that our minds are primed for that.
We're ready for it.
It's right under the hood. And all we need is a little bit of a wake up, and it's there.
We're all leaning towards love, all of us. And it's right there for us. I know in my own process of meditative practice, it's certainly, it does build up over many years. And for me, it's many decades.
We are really trying to figure out ways to bring this out into the world using unconventional methods. And one of the things that's clear, and it certainly comes with all kinds of complications and limitations, but one of the things that's clear is if this kind of work is going to be deployed at scale, it's going to have to use technology in some way, shape, or form. And exactly how to do that, we're not sure, but we are committed to trying, and we feel like we have a moral obligation to try. The world needs this kind of practice. I know the cellist, the other was Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, and the third was a guy named Ed Wilson, who's a famous neurosurgeon in California at UCSF. And these people are the best in the world at what they do, and it asks, what do they have in common? Practice, practice, practice. So I think that there's ultimately no substitute for that.
None. I don't think there is either. I mean, anyone who asks me about meditating, there's a question here. You have to do it. And we are such lazy beings, but find a way that you do it every day, the same time. You sit on your cushion. It becomes part of your eating ritual, your ritual of taking a shower, brushing your teeth, that it is who you are. And the benefit of my own experience and the people around me, you definitely have a permanent experience that opens up in ways that you never would have expected or dreamed. Now there's a...
Start right now. In fact, let's do it for a minute. Why don't we do it?
I actually asked Mathieu to do this when we did one of these.
To actually meditate?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Just sit up in a dignified position so you don't fall asleep. And close your eyes and bring your attention to your breath. Don't try to control your breath. Just watch the natural inflow and outflow. Breathing in, breathing out. Stay with the full in-breath, the full out-breath, the pause between and the next breath. And when your mind wanders, just notice that it wandered and bring it back to your breath. And start with the next one. Full in-breath, the full out-breath. And now you can open your eyes. That's the basic instruction. Richard, stop meditating.
No, I was just saying that when I started, my first teachers were Zen. And it became very important in early Zen training to think about this place called the hara, which is it's a chakra just below the navel, but it's 3 or 4 finger widths below the navel and towards the back. And if you can, that's also where your abdomen is. And as you're breathing through the abdomen, that's where you put your mind, is right there. And you'll see that your mind will wander and you'll be up in thoughts up in here. Bring it right back down. And you'll start to activate this very powerful energy source in this area. So when you're breathing, think of it from here. Not from up in your head or anything, really from here. And it will start to settle. I find that it settles the mind much quicker. But that is an incredibly powerful source right here of being, this area right here.
The idea is not to stop your mind from wandering. The idea is to notice when it wandered, to be mindful. Oh, my mind wandered. I don't have to follow that thought. I'll go back to the practice, to the meditation.
Yeah, so in many ways, the essence of meditation is awareness. And we're not trying to fix anything, we're not trying to change anything, we're not trying to block anything, we're not trying to stop thoughts. It's simply being aware and recognizing this very basic quality of awareness that we all have. And simply through repeated interrogation of our own mind, that becomes more and more familiar. And as it becomes more and more familiar, the mind begins to settle. But that's really what this kind of developmental process is about.
Well, that process is twofold in terms of where the process can go. And these early stages of just beginning following the breath is essentially taming the mind from being crazy and taking us places we don't particularly want to go. But there is a certain amount of concentration and will associated with that. I think once that concentration has become second nature, of focusing on one thing, then you can use that like a wild horse. Once you've tamed that horse, you can do tricks with it, you can do amazing things with it. It will take you places which are very, sometimes quite complicated and sometimes just purely delicate, that the mind itself is so close to us, the vast mind is so close that we can't see it. But it's right there, and it's so subtle, that difference between kind of lost in the world we normally are and the flip side of that, which is vast and open and unbounded, no center, no dimension. It can't even be described, but it's right there, right there, so subtle, right there at every second. How meaningful that is to communicate the depth of what the Buddha discovered, the extraordinary revolution and courage it took to get there, of what he was able to experience. And he went through the same process. Once he became enlightened, he had no idea how he could communicate what had happened to him.
That's right.
And the story is that the Dakinis and the angels, they came to him and begged him. And he really was at a loss. And he started a very simple way to explain what had happened to him. He called it the Four Noble Truths. But then he started to expand really what happened to him. And it was the nature of mind itself and emptiness. That the mind is empty of inherent existence. This whole thing is empty of inherent existence. His Holiness understands the nature of that is not really Buddhism. It's a revolution in way beyond Buddhism. And it can't be explained in a rational way, in a conceptual way. It can only be experienced. And this is one of those pioneering steps along the way to help a lot of people get closer to having that extraordinary experience.